Hello and welcome to Perspective. I am JAWAD TEHAMI. Well, let's start with 55 BC, at the time of Julius Caesar, when he had the intent of toppling the Roman Republican Senate. The news of his intention reached very fast to the Senate, despite he being thousands of miles away. Fast forward today, in this information age, the news dissemination or the information flow has transcended the geographical boundaries. According to one study, on the contrary, when it comes to news or information that is true, but on the contrary, when we talk about the fake news or the rumors, they spread 70 times faster as compared to the truth. Now, due to the information age, there were a lot of opportunities. Due to technological revolution and the innovation, there were a lot of opportunities to reap the dividends in form of collaboration and connectivity. But at the same time, many challenges have emerged and they are posing a grave threat to global security as well as national integration at various levels. There are certain tools, including fake news, disinformation, and misinformation, which are being used by malicious elements in order to halt the democratic processes, the democratic decision-making, as well as to confuse and agitate. There is a debate that the social media platforms are also being used by the rival nations in order to malign their adversaries as well. This is a very important topic, and this threat is causing a lot of danger, not at the national level, but also at the global level, as well as at the individual level. And what are those remedies, or what are those measures the global leaders or these social media platform runners can actually take in order to curb these particular tools, especially when we talk about fake news, disinformation, deepfakes, and misinformation. And talk about this very burning issue, I am joined by an esteemed panel of guests today in the studio. I am joined by Ms. Farwa Naqvi, who is an integrative psychotherapist, and she serves at Counseling and Psychotherapy Central Awarding Body. She is joining me in the studio, and Mr. Asad Beg, who is founder Media Lab and Media Matters of Democracy. He is also joining me in the studio. So I'll begin the discussion with you, Mr. Beg. How grave is this particular threat of fake news, disinformation, and misinformation when it comes to halting the democratic processes such as the elections and the election campaigns?
To answer your question very simply, generally it's extremely dangerous. And let me give you an anecdote. So the World Economic Forum, which is a very important body, very known body, in 2013 they declared misinformation as one of the gravest evils of the world, the ills of the world. And they declared it as a threat to humanity. I'm not talking about one nation, I'm not talking about a continent, I'm talking about humanity. And that was 2013, by the way, and that's the extent of the problem that we are talking about. Right now, you rightly pointed out that misinformation is not just about a false information or a fake news, quote unquote, spreading on the social media. It's actually being weaponized and used as a tool to target opponents, to target human rights defenders and journalists across the world, to target nations, and to target and sort of achieve other political gains and whatnot.
So, Ms. Farwa, what do you think? How does misinformation, fake news, and disinformation actually halt the democratic processes when it comes to the general awareness of the masses in order for them to decide which political party or the politician they are going to vote for?
I think on individual level, on a very individual level, it is very anxiety provoking for people to actually, have that threat hovering around, their heads that it could be me, or, something can be directed towards me as well, such as that. And these things, misinformation, I think in politics, it also kinds of makes or curates that kind of a culture where certain things and certain trends, they're kind of like when one news gets some more attention of people, which is obviously a bad one or something like that. So, and then other people also kind of like follow that trend, and do that about other people. So it also, on a very social level, I think it also does that to the society. So I think, yeah, that is what I think about the psychology and the psychological impact of it.
Okay, Mr. Beg, how to differentiate between a truthful news and a fake news, because general public doesn't have that training or that awareness that they can differentiate, and the kind of pace the information flow is happening at, they've got a very little time in order to compete with their peers. There is a peer pressure, of course. So what are those basic areas on the basis of which they can differentiate between whether it is a true news or a fake news?
I think that's a very, very important question, but I think before answering that, I'll very quickly go to the point that you raised earlier in the first question. How does misinformation affect the democratic processes? I'll give you the example of American elections in 2016. We saw that there was a massive influx of misinformation, not coming from within the US, but coming from outside the US. Primarily, one of the countries, for instance, that the misinformation was being generated from was Macedonia. And a lot of international media outlets did very good investigative stories on it. And turned out there was no political interest, but there was an economic interest that was kind of fueling that misinformation and the production of it and so on. So that's very important, and then we saw the whole sort of quote-unquote the Russian influence and the investigations thereof and so on. So it has a very direct impact on the democratic processes. Now, to answer your question, how do the public, the general public, differentiate between misinformation and disinformation? I think you've rightly pointed out yourself, you've kind of answered it yourself, that the people don't have the awareness. Now that's our responsibility, or the state's responsibility. By that I mean, the government's responsibility. There is this term called media and information literacy, and that's really the crux of everything. People need to understand the sources that they can trust of information, and the sources they need to investigate when they sort of consume the information from the sources. Mainstream media, for instance, that needs to be trusted. Now, the role of media itself has really not been conducive, to be honest with you. And we've seen researches that we have conducted in Pakistan that people have only average trust on the mainstream media. That's extremely dangerous. I think the media needs to sort of make itself the official source of information, and they need to improve their role. And I'll, obviously we'll talk about that later in the show, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. I'm joined by another participant, Mr. Asad Rahim Khan, who is a legal expert. Thank you very much for your time. Mr. Khan, when we talk about the trust of the general public in the conventional forms of media, there are studies that depict that the people trust more of the newspaper items. They consider them more credible and authentic as compared to the new digital media platforms. Why do you think the social media platforms or the digital media platforms weren't able to garner that kind of confidence and trust of the general public? Mr. Asad, can you hear me? Mr. Asad, can you kindly unmute? I'll try to reconnect to you, Mr. Asad. So, Mr. Asad, you were talking about the trust. My similar question to you as well. Why these social media platforms haven't been able to garner that kind of confidence and trust as compared to the conventional forms of media when it comes to newspapers specifically, because they are considered more credible and authentic?
Because the two are completely different in every way possible. Now, this is a common misconception that I've seen in the general public also, but also in academia and other kind of places as well, that they kind of equate mainstream media with social media. Now, social media is only a place where people exist, where the people's voice their concerns, their expression, whatever they feel like, right? Whereas media is a mainstream institution. And I'm saying institution because as you would go in the newsroom, you would see that there are certain checks and balances that kind of the news that you broadcast has to filter from.
Is it because of the editorial policy and the gatekeeping?
And the gatekeeping, yes, and also the professional sort of way that the news is generated as a product, right? Because that's the news really is the product of a newsroom, right? And that obviously is not happening in the mainstream, in the social media, my apologies. And that's because it's not supposed to happen, because the social media is a place where people gather, talk and express themselves. The point of concern here is that the people of the Pakistan, and basically news consumer in general, needs to understand this kind of distinction between the media and the social media. My understanding is that this distinction does not exist in people's mind. They say, oh, we've seen on the Facebook, it must be true. And that's where kind of, the basic problem starts.
So, Ms. Farwa, what do you think, what platforms are those? Because according to a study, the platforms which are owned by Facebook, including Insta and WhatsApp, they are leading in spreading the fake news and disinformation. Do you agree with that?
See, I mean, of course, Twitter is one of the places, and although it may be sponsored in a way, but here everybody's psychology and the way they're working and the way, the social media platform and connectivity works here, I feel that now everybody's a journalist, and there's no way of going around the source of the news, because they're not real journalists. I mean, they don't have any censorship, as you were talking about, editorial policies and stuff. So it is also on the as you mentioned, Facebook and stuff. But now it has also become a trend of people just to connect, and just the psychology, just the very psychology of people who want to. So what sort
of psychology is at work over here? When you get a new information at your hand, so what is that very first thought that comes into your mind before you go further sharing it?
So I feel, and this is my opinion, of course, not to generalize, but what happens is that these social media platforms, they're kind of like curated, and very primary purpose of them is to get you guys and everybody to see more ads, right? So the algorithm also works like that, and it is curated in a way to make you addicted and hooked. So now what happens that, when from the logo to the notification thing, everything is there to make you get very addictive to it. So for the likes and the fact that, I tweeted it first, I put it out in the world first, and the retweets and stuff. So in that, you will not wait and, confirm the source.
Mr. Asad Rahim Khan, thank you for joining in. So with the advent of social media platforms, we have seen there are certain tools which are being used by malicious elements such as fake news, deepfakes, misinformation and disinformation. Do we see the rising number of litigation in courts as well, owing to the feuds which are caused due to these tools which are used by malicious elements?
Gee, thank you so much for having me. We are actually seeing a rising incidence of cases being filed either before the cybercrime wing or using a plethora of other law. And purely within the legal spectrum, there is the urgent need to now rationalize the different drafts of legislation that we have. If you just take up something like hate speech, that falls within the ambit of the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and the Pakistan Penal Code. And a lot of these provisions are overbroad and haven't been appropriately distinguished between differing provisions. So we need judicial determinations and further legislation to be able to clarify that for the average citizen. To answer your previous question, sir, with regards to how we're seeing this tussle between social media and mainstream media, I agree with what the other participants have said, and they've said it very well, that there is a credibility problem with regards to social media. But why are people turning towards it? It is from an increasing dissatisfaction worldwide, especially in Pakistan, more so in the United States, from mainstream media outlets. They are considered partisan, they are considered unimpartial, and when the average media consumer thinks that he can actually get a better fix from social media, from a more direct access to what is going on the ground, or rather his perception of what's going on in the ground within that echo chamber, that's when they turn to social media for that sort of immediacy or that sort of bias confirmation. And I think this is a very dangerous phenomenon that we can't really underplay. The mainstream media, whether that's large newspapers or television channels, need to understand that they need to get back into the game, they need to restore their credibility, and they need to actually seem more impartial than they are right now.
Is it because of the political and the economic influences on the conventional media, especially when you talk about the broadcast media? The journalists and the media outlets are influenced by those leanings?
Certainly. So many of our channels are actually entirely part of the informal economy. Some if you'll forgive me for saying, have been accused of being laundering operations. Others are barely disguised political operations that are just doing it for influence because their own inherent business models are completely unworkable. So when you have a conventional media landscape that is so inherently problematic or that raises so many questions, that's when people actually start turning towards social media.
The social media platforms. Your point is well taken. So, Mr. Beg, when we talk specifically about this thing, the trust level of the general public in the conventional media, it owes to the credibility and the authenticity of not a certain specific media outlet, but also that of a journalist as well. So what measures do you think the conventional broadcast media or the associated journalists can take in order to rebuild that confidence in the general masses?
I think that's another very good question. But unfortunately, it's like a chicken and egg story. It's the vicious circle that the media and the news consumers and everybody else is kind of stuck in. Let me very quickly explain this. Like Asad pointed out, media itself, the newsroom's revenue itself is failing, and it's going down. They have less and less ways to generate legal, legitimate revenue for themselves. As a result, they're trying to compete with the social media by introducing the equal or even more amount of sensationalism that the social media gets, by gratifying their consumers, by kind of taking political sides and siding on a certain side of political spectrum to kind of garner more viewership from that particular spectrum. And by doing that, they're losing the trust of the general public in them. And so, the question comes back again, that why are they doing it? Because they think that this is their way to survive. This is their existential battle, so to speak, that they're fighting themselves. Because I personally feel that they're deprived of the legitimate revenue. And that's primarily again the responsibility of the government itself. We can go on and on about what policies and so on affect this, but the crux of the matter is that the mainstream media is kind of in itself fighting an existential battle. And this is all a result of that.
There is a study, Ms. Farwa, that people think that politicians and the political parties play a key role in spreading fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. So how does the psychology of a politician or a certain specific political party plays when it comes to spreading such information with impunity, and how does it affect the general masses?
I feel, this is a very good question, because the psychology of the politician would be very different from the psychology of people who are at the receiving end of the news and who are also, agents to spreading the news. So when a politician does this, of course, if somebody is wanting to be the prime minister, somebody is wanting to win an election, it is a very black and white thing. So in order for me to win, I will have to either I become the good guy or I make the other person the bad one. So it is very black and white kind of a thinking, and that is how it is projected out into the world. And so for me to win, you have to also assume that, okay, this is the only option and this is the bad guy. And all of the news and stuff is projected over there, and vice versa. So to add on to into the previous question and what Asad was also saying, the thing is that people are, they exist in tribes. So we want connection, and we want to kind of like, jump onto the bandwagon to, gain connection and gain that kind of society for ourselves. Social media is also doing that. And, the way it triggers our stress responses. So in that, we're not able to think very clearly or kind of like, take a deep breath and just do the same thing. We're just kind of like fighting or flight and all of that. So all of this, and in the media also, it is projected like the breaking news and all. It's projected as if, it's do or die situation. So I think all of these things also kind of like trigger the people on the receiving end, oh my God, now, I've got to do something as well and kind of jump onto the bandwagon, because all of the social media platforms and the fake news thing, it really actually does impact the mental health of people, at the receiving end on both sides. So it is played like that psychologically as well, the misinformation spread effect.
So Mr. Asad, what do you think, what role the political parties or the politicians have to play over here? Because if they are using these tools against their opponents, such type of tools can be used against them as well. It can hit them hard as well.
Well, we saw a classic example of that with the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, the latest ordinance, which made offenses, or rather offenses that pertain to harming one's reputation, non-bailable offenses. And they linked that to insulting institutions, etc., etc. Now, obviously, the initial criticism was that the vast majority of such offenses are already catered to by existing laws. And you had the Islamabad High Court finally strike down the ordinance and say that it was against the fundamental rights of the citizenry. But when you decide to, in 2022, ensure that defamation is actually a criminal offense, that there are non-bailable implications to such an offense, that somebody writing a semi-irresponsible tweet can actually be picked up, that just goes to show how fraught the political situation is. Political parties do have an immediate responsibility to ensure not just that this legislation is rationalized, and it doesn't seem like that is happening. Bear in mind that PICA itself was passed by the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz. The ordinance that built on it was passed by, rather promulgated by the PTI. So until there is a political consensus, we don't see much rationalization happening from a legislative standpoint. Now, moving away from the law, the parties are themselves also very responsible with regards to the polarization that we see in this country. We saw earlier with regards to certain religious offense FIRs being filed that this is just, pushing this country's political discourse more and more to the precipice. So with regards to all major legislation, defamation and hate speech and fake news also has to be dealt with in a bipartisan way, and not in a way that ensures that your political opponents are going to get caught in the crossfire when you are in power.
Okay, Mr. Asif, whenever any sort of legislation, whenever there are unusual circumstances, of course, they require unusual or desperate measures as well. So in this information age, when there is immense information flow and everybody has got the chance to share whatever they think, so what is that thin line? Because the constitution of majority of the countries in the world who've got democracy as a system in place, they guarantee the freedom of expression and speech. On the other hand, what is that thin line that can differentiate while legislating in order to give that leverage to the general public that they can share whatever they want, but there are certain limitations and there are no political whims and wishes involved of a certain political party at the same time as well?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's by way of some context, it's an open secret that the recent PICA ordinance happened because of certain people's, easily bruised egos. The distinction we have to strike is between civil offenses and criminal offenses. Now, if you have something that falls within a civil issue, which is that my reputation has been harmed or my reputation has been damaged, then you fall within the ambit of the defamation law of 2002. Which provides for compensatory damages, and there are various cases where compensation has been awarded. The other end of that line is where you are actually attacking state institutions, or you are indulging in hate speech that threatens already heavily persecuted minorities, or you are doing something that is a crime against the state or damages the state or harms its own monopoly of violence. That is the distinction to be drawn. So for our legislators to now start reading in criminal punishments for essentially civil matters, that is, I think, where we go wrong. Where there is hate speech, where there is attacks on institutions or an overall delegitimization of what state interests are, then yes, I think there can be criminal consequences. But right now, the overwhelming array of cases that we see are essentially civil defamation issues which are being dressed up as criminal offenses. And that's the legislative line you need to take.
Right. Mr. Beg, what do you think when it comes to the legislation for certain offenses which are being committed on digital media spaces? We've seen in the West as well, they have been facing a lot of challenges in order to curtail this particular menace of fake information and disinformation. Do you think it becomes that easier a thing for those countries where democracy hasn't flourished that much, and the whims and the wishes of a certain vested interest group or a certain political party are not incorporated in that very legislation?
Look, I think first off, we don't need any legislations. Asad has done a great job of explaining it. I think we need to actually undo some of the legislations that we have in this point in time. I'll give you an example. For instance, the Islamabad High Court recently, they struck down PECA ordinance, but they've also struck down 3 words from the section 20 of original PECA, which basically is the criminal defamation section of the law, right? And in the decision, the Honorable Justice Minilla himself has noted that the governments, they need to review the reforms and reforms the civil defamation laws, and they need to use the civil defamation laws for similar offenses, like Asad explained very nicely. So I think legislations we already have in place. In fact, we have many more legislation. So for instance, just for defamation, I tell you, we have 2002 law that Asad was talking about, civil defamation. Then we have 499 of the PPC, that's criminal defamation. Then we have section 20, which was struck down that I've been talking about of PECA. Then we have another section in the PEMRA Code of Conduct for misinformation and so on, that the people have been fined on. And so we have enough legislations. You asked the question, which I think is extremely important, that what political parties can do. I think they need to come out and they need to say and tell their followers that we have zero tolerance on hate and any kind of incitement that our followers do. How many political parties can do that? I'm not sure, because they are themselves weaponizing this kind of speech, and they're using their followers as a means of kind of pressurizing either the government or the opposition or whoever they want. Because they themselves are getting
beg your pardon for the interruption. When we see the kind of polarization, not only over here in South Asia or the countries where the democracy hasn't flourished that much, we have seen that polarization in the second largest democracy of the world. We see that Capitol Hill riots happening as well. And then the former president, Mr. Donald Trump, was also put off from Twitter as well, and he couldn't share that information. So that polarization exists over there in the West as well. Do you think when it comes to the interests of a certain political party, they are going to be having that moral standing in order to inculcate among their supporters and the voters that, look, we do have zero tolerance when it comes to spreading hate speech or spreading any sort of misinformation?
Look, even if they don't have a moral standing, then the people of the Pakistan, they need to make them accountable for not having that moral standing, right? Because what else political parties should do if not have a moral standing? So, and you rightly pointed out, the people in America, for instance, attacking the Capitol Hill, and we all know that incident, and I don't think we need to talk any more about that, but that's an excellent example. And so my only question with the political parties in Pakistan, are we waiting for an incident like that in Pakistan to happen, and then you come out and say that we have no tolerance for hate and incitement, or should we do it before as a precautionary measure? Because we are very close to something like that, frankly speaking.
Okay, when we talk about the number of litigation or the cases which are pending in the Pakistani courts, so when we talk about the implementation of already the legislation which has been done, do you think there is a need of establishing new courts for the said purpose when it comes to this misinformation which are associated with the digital platforms?
Sorry, are you asking me that question?
Yes, please.
No, I don't think so. Because look, it's very, very difficult to actually establish what is misinformation and what is not. So how do you establish that what is fake news? I'm a reporter, I have a scoop, and I give a very exclusive news, which the government or whoever political party or whoever party it is about, they're denying. But I have my sources, and I also have my right to hide my sources and keep them to myself. So how do you establish that the new, and how many times do you do that? For every single do we do
that
this?
Interpretation has to do with the judicial jurisdiction and the judicial discretion, right?
It is, you're absolutely right. But my point is that it's completely impractical to do it. Imagine the number of news consumers we have. Imagine the number of Facebook users we have in Pakistan. Every single time they post something, do you think we have the capacity to? So frankly speaking, this is not the solution. The solution, and I'll tell you the solution, obviously, if I'm not taking too much time, if I may, should I continue?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So the solution is not very simple, let me just tell you that. We need to start, one, with the adult learning and the idea of media and information literacy for everybody. This is extremely important because, I think we really, we really hadn't, people in Pakistan, the general population, they haven't had the time.
Okay, Mr. Beg, this is a very, very pertinent and important point. I would like to discuss that one a little more in detail, this particular specific point, the digital media platforms literacy among not only in adults, but also among the school-going children as well. So, Ms. Farba, do you think the kind of offenses which are being committed because of this particular facility that has been given to us, the social media platforms, the same question to you. Do you think the number of cases which are pending in the Pakistani courts, and there is a huge backlog, do you think when people start going to the courts with these sort of complaints, that the offenses which are being committed against them on the digital media platforms, there should be a separate sort of tribunal or the court or any other remedial authority in separate powers to the already established courts?
I feel that there are like a lot of cases, everybody knows the cases that are pending, and it is taking years for them to kind of, the murder cases, the criminal cases, they're like different kinds of courts and different, there are categories and sections. So I think for this, if the governments and if we really want to do something about it, or something which is like more cyber related, or something which is more related to these things, because it is something everybody's facing, everybody's using social media, everybody's being subjected to something like that. So I think that these cases would be a lot if something like an initiative like that is taken.
So that's not a viable option according to you, right?
I feel that something separately should be there. I mean, I'm not saying that
Okay.
no, but like probably.
Your point is well taken. Mr. Asad, is it a viable thing to establish separate courts or the remedial authority in order to deal with these sort of cases?
Certainly not. And I'll link this to another example, which is obviously very, very different. But with regards to militancy and terrorism, we created a special set of courts, the anti-terrorism courts of 1997. Then we created another set of special courts, the Protection of Pakistan courts of 2014. Finally, we then instituted military courts in 2015 after they had already been struck down in the late 90s with regards to Karachi. So despite 3 sets of special courts, the issue of religious militancy was not solved in a way that could be said was either judicial or had to do with our criminal legal system. The point being that our multiplicity of courts has not really created any benefit for our judicial system, as its major issue remains delay. You can create any number of fora that still has been found not to make this entire process any more efficient. So what would be better is that we have, and this is not something that pertains just to social media offenses, it pertains to the fact that you cannot enforce a basic contract in this country. It pertains to the overall judicial system. Our issue is the speed between which you institute a case and you dispose of one. And for that you have to do multiple things. That includes regularization of land title, reduction of appellate fora, the ultimate superior courts putting a bar in terms of how many cases they actually accept for hearing, and deciding to do away with cases that are not of constitutional or legal importance. And the same pertains to media offenses. We saw in the previous dispensation that they were creating yet another authority, the PMRA authority. And over here I'd also wish to commend Mr. Beg. His knowledge of the law with regards to this field is better than any lawyers I've come across. When you create a parallel authority like this also, this just again does not fix the core problem. The core problem is speed.
Right. Mr. Asad Beg, as you were mentioning, there is an important aspect of this whole gamut to be discussed. I was thinking, why not include the social media or digital media ethics in the curriculum as a compulsory subject right from the school, as the languages are made compulsory. There are certain other subjects which are made compulsory, so that the generation which is going to grow up in later years, they have that very know-how, how to responsibly use social media platforms. And later on, these compulsory subjects can be included in at the college and the university level as well.
I think now we are talking. So if I may sum up the solutions and the recommendations in 3 points. One, I think you've rightly pointed out yourself that generally the knowledge about media and information literacy is extremely important. You also pointed out that not just for adults but for children. We have seen in the countries, I'm not obviously going to talk a lot about that, but we have seen MIL curriculum in starting from middle sort of education in various countries in South Asia, right? And so this is extremely important that we start talking about, number one. Number two, which I think has to do with what Asad pointed out with regards to the legal reforms and essentially speeding up the process. People do not trust the laws in Pakistan, right? So for instance, we've seen what happens to civil defamations. They run for years upon years upon years without any conclusive decision. I mean, if you look at the cases, for instance, of civil defamation in the UK, you would find out they're very effective, right? So I think we need to ensure that the civil defamation laws in Pakistan that are effective and the courts are kind of speedily providing justice on them, so the people have a general amount of trust in them. And as opposed to using the criminal sort of defamation, civil defamation is used because it's also a remedy which needs to be available to the people of Pakistan.
So Ms. Farwa, what do you say about this, including social media ethics as a compulsory subject right from the school level? Do you think it would work in the longer run?
I think because everybody is using social media, and kids more than anyone else, they can't be without their iPads these days. So I feel that, yeah, certainly there should be something, and other than that, even the very ethics of our social interactions and stuff, they are missing from the curriculum. It's just not the social media. So a lot, and also something also needs to be done about the excessive usage of social media and politics related and generally as well, because our brains are not made to firstly receive so much an influx of information like that, and on top of that usage of social media and screens and all of that. So I think something also needs to be done if you are concerned about the child's mental health and mental well-being in the long run as well, because I can see for a fact that I observe like every day the little kids are developing addictive potential in them from that age, when they can't be without their iPads and stuff, and they want that gratification and all of that. So it's really impacting.
So parental controls happen to be very crucial at that stage, right?
Parental controls or some kind of like workshops, awareness, because parents, I think they also just need little space or a little peace to themselves, and they're like, okay, fine. So I think awareness about the extreme kind of repercussions of this behavior in the long term is also, the awareness for that is also very important.
So Mr. Asad, what do you think? Do you agree with this suggestion if we include social media or digital media ethics in curriculum at various levels? Would it work in the longer run in order to make the people digitally, socially responsible?
There is the overall problem, I think, of ethics in general. So I think this is a wonderful suggestion that we should actually institute this and make this part of the curriculum. This is only going to become an increasingly larger part of our lives. So if there is something that you institute within your curriculum, yes, one should. I think the thing that has to happen concurrently is digital literacy within our judicial system. So you have many courts that are grappling with whether social media can even be considered something that should be litigated upon or not. You can now put that down to a generational transition. You can put that down to the fact that they don't want to muddy existing precedent, but it requires a sea change in what the perspective of our adjudicators is. And you are seeing that there are certain progressive judgments, especially by the Sindh High Court and the Islamabad High Court, leading the way, but we need more of that, and that again happens through training with regards to digital literacy, understanding just how much mental real estate social media now takes up, and also an overall rationalization of our legislation, whether that includes the Defamation Law of 2002, or the Pakistan Penal Code, or the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, or specifically with regards to hate speech and speech that involves criminal consequences, the Anti-Terrorism Act. So all of this needs to be done as soon as possible.
Right. Mr. Beg, we have seen recently the EU Disinfo Lab busted a fake news and disinformation campaign. There was a network of the Indian websites and news outlets to malign all those countries which were in conflict with India, specifically when we talk about Pakistan. So the EU Disinformation Lab, termed as the operation, or as it was termed by it, among other activities, considered of creation of fake media in Brussels, Geneva, and across the world, as well as the repackaging of dissemination of content via ANI and obscure local media networks. When it comes to the nations' inter-rivalry, so we have seen the evidence of a certain rival country trying to malign Pakistan. What sort of strategies or the measures do you think a certain state can take in order to counter that?
I think first off, this should be raised in the United Nations, because it's an extremely serious problem. Look, we are not only talking about India, we're talking about a number of other countries here as well, right? And you, again, very rightly pointed out that it was an operation, quote unquote, which essentially means that it was organized, premeditated, and it was directed or aimed at a certain kind of a benefit of sorts and whatnot. And this kind of shows that there, and the involvement of ANI, which is the news agency and whatnot. So this shows that this cannot be done, or this whole operation cannot exist without actual influence from within the government or even the parentship of the government itself. So we see that there are indications of the Indian government being involved in this. And in another show, I remember, I think on PTV World, I said that the Indian government is playing with fire because they do not know what they're doing with this misinformation, and this can very easily backfire on them, because the kind of networks that they're creating, the kind of emanation in terms of information ecosystem that they're creating, it can very easily backfire on them. And we've seen that operation recently in action also, because there was, I think last year, there was this hashtag civil war in Pakistan or Karachi or something, and there's 61% of tweets were coming from India in that hashtag. And again, it's a very clear example, well, a small one, but a very clear example of how some of these factories are used. So to answer your questions, I think United Nations is the best forum where this should be raised.
Okay, we've lost the connection with Mr. Asad Rahim Khan. We'll try to reconnect to him as to know, are there any remedies at the global level when it comes to the United Nations, or what does the international law says about this particular thing? So, Ms. Verma, when we talk about enhancing the bilateral relationships, particularly when it comes to the two rival nations that are Pakistan and India, it always comes in debate that the people-to-people contacts should be enhanced in order to curtail that trust deficit. So with this sort of sinister campaign, such as the EU Disinfo Lab has busted of India trying to malign Pakistan, up to which scale and up to which level do you think that very idea of enhancing the people-to-people contacts between the two countries gets the hit? I
think that it is not that everybody in India was kind of like probably involved in that project or an operation, whatever you guys are saying, because if we see a lot of people in India, they have very good and positive thoughts about Pakistan and vice versa. So it is the politics and the politicians and how those agencies and how those things are made, and they're directed towards the military of that country. They're also kind of like very active into the wishful thinking of the civil wars and stuff. So I think it is not that a lot of people are, the general public is very much involved. It could be, but I think those are two different things. And I don't know, what do you think?
Right, Mr. Asad Beg, how do you think this particular idea of people-to-people contacts gets that hit after such a campaign is launched by a certain country against the other?
Look, like I said, it's like playing with fire, because when you create information ecosystem ammunition, it can be very easily used against the government that is created. So we've seen numerous examples of this in the world. You are talking about people-to-people relations. I think the people-to-people relations cannot exist without at least a neutral stance from the governments, and we've seen that the Indian government does not have a neutral stance here. So for people-to-people relation to exist, I think first off, there has to be a neutral stance and generally a good sort of understanding of the importance of the bilateral relations between India and Pakistan, specifically within the Indian government. I think that general sort of jingoistic attitude, specifically in and around the elections that we see, that really has to end, because that's now old politics. Even for India, that's now old politics. Specifically, BJP, if I talk about, I mean, all of their political campaigns are essentially about Pakistan. I don't see how's that even a concern for them.
So are there any remedies, are there any options at the international level? Do you think Pakistan, after this particular sinister campaign has been busted by the EU Disinfo Lab with all the evidences and the proofs, do you think Pakistan can take it to any international fora, especially when we talk about the International Criminal Court?
Look, I think not the criminal court specifically, but this should have been raised very actively in the United Nations. I mean, we've seen in the recent assemblies and whatnot, and this is my personal view, I think this should have been raised a little more actively and with a little more sort of rigor there on the floor. I mean, we talked about other things, we talked about Islamophobia, we talked about a lot of other issues, great. But listen, this is extremely important, because this is, like I said, it cannot happen without the friendship of the Indian government itself. And it was very premeditated, and it was aimed at creating unrest and incitement in Pakistan. Now, this is again a serious problem. So perhaps whoever is in the Foreign Office and the next time around, they should raise it, because it's the operation. Even if it's uncovered, it's still there, and the ANI we see is still pretty much operating with the same kind of history that they have against Pakistan. And so this should be raised in the next General Assemblies, and I really hope that whoever is in the foreign ministry this time around in Pakistan, they will perhaps do a better job of raising them in the United Nations.
Right, Mr. Asad Beg, founder Media Lab and Media Matters for Democracy. Thank you very much for joining me in the studio. Ms. Farwa Naqvi, integrative psychotherapist, counseling and psychotherapy central awarding body. You are associated with that. You also joined me in the studio. And Mr. Asad Rahim Khan was joining us on Skype. He is a legal expert. Thank you, all of you, for your precious time. At a perspective, to conclude today's discussion, social media or digital media platforms don't happen to be a bad thing in themselves. It is upon our use, whether how we use it, make it good or bad. With that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Until the next show, stay tuned to BTV World.